But I want to remind folks this is a daily issue, the issue of gun violence, and particularly the issue of gun violence against children. Early this morning, 3 kids were shot just outside their home in southeast Houston. A 12-year-old is in critical condition. It's a daily drumbeat of gun violence, devastating our community, hurting our kids, killing our kids many times. It's time for us to demand more action, to meet this moment with real change, to do something different from what's taken place after every one of these mass shootings. Here in Harris County, we've implemented policies to address this issue, and I'll cover some of those later on, but there's only so much we can do at the county level. There are actually laws that prevent us as a county from implementing policies around gun safety, safe storage. We need our state lawmakers, along with our members of Congress, to step up, to find the moral courage to pass laws that are going to put an end to this once and for all, that are going to protect our children and our communities from gun violence. This week's bipartisan proposal on Capitol Hill signals real progress. Legislative efforts across both parties to finally begin addressing this issue, to break through the seal of bipartisan gridlock, and we must continue in this vein. But we have to acknowledge that even if what's being proposed becomes law, those are small steps toward meaningful change. They're an important first step, but there's still so much more to be done, and just those few points are not going to necessarily address the issue to a particularly significant degree, or as significant a degree as it needs to be addressed. With schools starting back up in 10 weeks, there's also an element of urgency that leads us to focus back on the state level. Our children don't have time to wait for all of these incremental steps on gun safety policies. That's why today we're putting forth a resolution. I'll be proud to support Commissioner Ellis's resolution, joining Bexar County Judge Nelson Wolf, joining Mayor Turner, so many other leaders, law enforcement leaders from all throughout the state and the San Antonio region as well, joining parents, joining teachers, joining children, many of whom marched this weekend, calling for a special session in Texas to pass gun safety laws in our state. If Governor Abbott can call 3 special sessions to make it harder for people to vote, surely he can call a special session to keep our kids from being massacred in their schools. In this special session, we're asking our legislature to no longer avoid the real issue of gun safety and pass laws around it. Some Texas legislators have already proposed ways to do that, and proposals that Texans support: raising the age from 18 to 21 for firearm purchases, passing red flag laws, background checks, requiring training for a license to carry. We're asking that a special session be called to consider this and other common sense policies. If national legislators can gather and come to an agreement, surely the state can at least consider these widely popular measures. In addition to that, we're announcing work today to continue our efforts in Harris County to protect youth specifically from gun violence. We all saw the data recently. According to the New England Journal of Medicine, in 2020 at the national level, firearm-related injuries became the leading cause of death among children and adolescents between 1 and 19 years of age, increasing 30% from 2019 to the end of 2020. According to the Institute of Forensic Sciences, that data bears out right now, and I want to share some data that is new. Firearms were the second most frequent cause of pediatric deaths, 0 to 17, in Harris County during 2020, after unexplained sudden deaths. And we are on track to surpass last year's youth deaths to gun violence. As I said, we saw another shooting just this morning. We as Harris County want to understand all of that even more at the local level. That's why we're proposing an analysis that will help us create even more efforts. Our analysis will help us identify microzones where youth violence is occurring, target areas where that's taking place, just as we're doing with gun violence more broadly. It'll help us identify risk factors among youth with even more specificity to find additional evidence-based ways to address gun violence in the county, particularly among youth. To be clear, this analysis happens amidst much work we're already doing. We've created the Community Violence Interruption Program to interrupt the cycle of gun violence. We've expedited the process for new criminal information to be available for background checks from our district clerk's office and the courts. We expanded our Safe Surrender Program, which requires individuals subject of a protective order for domestic violence to surrender their firearms. We announced the implementation of our Youth Justice Reinvestment Fund, which provides community support and resources to children at risk of justice involvement. We know that the epidemic of gun violence is preventable. We know that responsible gun laws in states where they take place, fewer people die by gun violence. You'd think after decades of enduring tragedies like Uvalde, like Sutherland Springs, Santa Fe, El Paso, that the state would have course corrected, but instead we all know they moved in the opposite direction, passing permitless carry. This is the chance to correct that. This is the time when Texans are watching, where Texans are asking for change, when kids are about to go back to school, when we know calling a special session is so easy. It happened 3 times just last year, a couple of years ago. And so, yes, we need more mental health resources. Absolutely. I'd be the first one to tell you that when we know our county jail is the largest mental health facility in the state. Yes, we need to look at broader issues, but we cannot address gun violence and the gun violence epidemic without addressing the need for gun safety policies. My hope is that as we do our work in Harris County, we can work together as a state, we can work together as a nation to finally tackle this. I'm going to repeat briefly in Spanish, and then Commissioner Ellis will give you an opportunity to speak. Quiero agradecerle al comisionado Ellis, quien como legislador trabajó en temas difíciles, temas bipartidistas, y es un ejemplo del tipo de trabajo que debe llevarse a cabo en este momento de urgencia. Seguimos de luto como nación por las muertes en Uvalde, y hoy día reconocemos que estos tiroteos son una ocurrencia diaria. Esta mañana, precisamente, 3 niños sufrieron por violencia armada en el sureste de Houston. Un niño de 12 años está en estado crítico en el hospital. Es el momento de responsabilizar a nuestros legisladores, no solo a nivel nacional, sino también a nivel estatal, para atacar este tema de la violencia armada. En el condado Harris hemos implementado políticas para abordar este tema, pero hay leyes estatales que nos prohíben el tomar muchos pasos. Hay leyes que específicamente dicen que los condados y las ciudades no pueden marcar políticas públicas alrededor del uso de las armas. La propuesta bipartidista en el Washington, D.C. de esta semana es un paso. Es el unir los esfuerzos legislativos de ambos partidos para poder tomar alguna acción en el tema de la violencia armada. Entonces hay que reconocer que es un paso importante. Pero también hay que reconocer que aunque pase esa propuesta y se convierta en ley, que eso no es suficiente para atacar el tema de la violencia armada, que las propuestas que han sido presentadas son bastante limitadas. También debemos recordar que las escuelas se retoman en 10 semanas. Nuestros niños no tienen tiempo para esperar a que pasen paso por paso a nivel estatal, a nivel nacional. Necesitamos acción a nivel del Estado ya mismo. Es por eso que nos unimos en el pedir una sesión especial de la legislatura del Estado de Texas. El juez del condado en el área de San Antonio, Nelson Wolf, ya pidió esto. Me uno también al alcalde Turner, a tantos líderes estatales, a tantos legisladores, a tantos padres de familia, maestros y niños, muchos muchachos que estuvieron marchando este fin de semana pidiendo lo mismo. Si el gobernador Abbott puede requerir 3 sesiones especiales de la legislatura para hacer más difícil el acceso al voto, claramente, obviamente, puede también llamar una sesión especial para abordar este tema de la violencia armada y la violencia armada en contra de nuestros niños. Ya varios legisladores han propuesto opciones de leyes. Por ejemplo, el requerir la edad de 21 años para comprar cualquier arma, las leyes de bandera roja, verificación de antecedentes antes de la venta y la compra de armas, requerir licencia para portar armas de fuego, cosas bastante básicas que ya existen en muchísimos otros países, prácticamente en todos los demás países. Pedimos que entonces se llame una sesión especial. Además, estamos anunciando más trabajo para continuar nuestros esfuerzos aquí en el Condado Harris en contra de la violencia armada, particularmente entre los niños. De acuerdo a estudios recientes, en el 2020 a nivel nacional, las lesiones relacionadas con armas de fuego se convirtieron en la principal causa de muerte entre los niños y adolescentes de 1 a 19 años de edad. En el Condado Harris, nuestro Instituto de Medicina Forense, nuestro Instituto Forense, tiene información nueva, datos nuevos que dicen que las armas fueron la segunda causa más frecuente de muertes pediátricas, de muertes de niños de 0 a 17 años. Y este año, eso fue en el 2020, este año vamos hacia el mismo camino. Queremos entender eso más a nivel local, entonces vamos a invitar un análisis de microzonas donde los jóvenes estén participando en la violencia armada, factores de riesgo, ¿qué más podemos hacer? Ya hemos estado haciendo muchísimos proyectos relacionados a este tema y hemos nombrado ya varios, pero como el programa de intervención de violencia comunitaria, se amplió un programa de entrega segura de las armas, hay un fondo de reinversión de justicia juvenil y aún más. Uno creería que después de décadas de tragedias, no solamente en Uvalde, en Santa Fe, El Paso, hace pocos años, Sutherland Spring, que el Estado habría ya marcado el cambio en esto, pero la verdad es que no lo han hecho, al contrario, pasaron leyes en la última sesión legislativa para aún facilitar más la posesión, la compra, la venta de las armas. Es el momento, ahora que todos lo están pidiendo, ahora que empieza la escuela en 10 semanas, ahora que se está logrando un poco de cambio nacional, es el momento de que el Estado llame una sesión especial, de que consideren al menos y ojalá pasen las leyes que los tejanos han venido esperando desde hace muchísimos años. Thank you so much. We'll hear from Commissioner Ellis.
Thank you, Judge. And you said everything that I want to say. I do want to say that I too applaud Senator Cornyn for the progress that he's been able to make. But as you said, it is incremental. I think one reason why the Biden administration is saying it is the biggest breakthrough in terms of responsible gun regulations in a couple of decades is because we've gone so far in the wrong direction, particularly in Texas. As a parent of 4 children, it's unnatural. None of us ever expect to bury our children. I just can't imagine what parents are going through when they have to deal with that. I do think that we have to offer much more than just thoughts and prayers. That's generally what people offer, and it has really become just such a phrase everybody uses. It's become meaningless. Gun violence is claiming lives every day among our children and teens. It is now the leading cause of death nationwide. Children, teens, and young people are taken to the streets, as the judge said. I spoke at the rally at City Hall this weekend. It was a remarkable crowd, and it was young people who inspired it. And I mentioned to them, as Martin Luther King's popularity and his ability to go out and galvanize volunteers began to wane against all of the advice of his advisors. He eventually agreed to bring in children. And it was children at a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement that propelled many of those national laws that we see today. We owe our youth better than they have been getting. They've been failed by inaction at the state and federal level for far too long. At the local level, as Judge Hidalgo said, we have to do everything that we can, despite the restrictions that have been put on us on the local level. In Harris County, my stats early indicated 20 kids lost, and as the judge mentioned, this year, maybe another 3 or 4 this morning. One in particular that touched me was a tragic drive-by shooting claiming Paul Vasquez's life, far too young, as he slept in his bed over this weekend. Judge, I want to commend you for directing the county to confront gun violence. we need more information. The gun lobby has actively undermined research into gun violence because they know that the data is such a powerful tool to make the point, and it is impossible to refute it. Common sense solutions that protect people instead of glorifying guns is what this research that the judge is directing the county to do will lead to. This makes the research effort proposed by her so important as we seek to develop any laws we can on the state or local level in Texas. This effort obviously is much broader. She mentioned the holistic approach that we take into gun violence. It is rooted in public health, community-based interventions, and common sense policies that put people ahead of politics. We owe it to these kids to make them safe from gun violence. Out of all the things we talk about in terms of protecting our community, as we've had an uptick in crime in certain areas, it's amazing how nobody wants to talk about the one thing that's just so sensible, no reasonable person could refute it. Why should we have more guns in America than anywhere else in the world being held by individual citizens? As she mentioned, over the years, I've worked on a number of common sense measures when I was in the legislature. She ran through them. I won't do it again, but they're all common sense measures. I think a national solution is what's needed more than anything else. In the absence of a massive, comprehensive federal law, Texas ought to step up, just as this state has stepped up and made it so easy for virtually anybody to get a gun, no matter how many mental health challenges one may have. The biggest area of concern I have about the federal law is a good part of it will use the carrot approach. My fear when the heat is off is that Texas, as has historically been the case, will be the last place in the nation to take a bite of that carrot. Perfect example would be our reluctance to take our federal money for Medicaid expansion, which, by the way, includes mental health coverage. The fact that we have not accepted it has to make you wonder if some people who are in public office need a little mental health coverage. Thank you, Judge. I'm honored to be with you.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll take any questions.
Judge Hidalgo, what's at stake here if this legislative session is not called? We're talking about school starting in the fall, or teachers or students. What message does it send if they don't listen to your plea here today?
I've spoken with so many teachers over the past few weeks, and they're terrified, they're sad, and in many ways, they're demoralized to not see action on this. So what's at stake? Possible copycats attacks, possible lives of kids in our schools. Teachers were gonna say, my job is hard enough as it is. Let's be practical about it. They had a hard time with the pandemic, with so many other challenges, and on top of that, you want them to play law enforcement officers. But let's zoom out a bit. It's not just about the schools and the school shootings. We mentioned it just this morning, 3 kids shot. This weekend, a child shot while he slept. This happens all the time in this state. This isn't a Harris County situation, and it happens because we haven't tackled the issue of gun safety policies. And so every day that goes by where the special legislative session is not called, every day that goes by where we talk about anything but the guns, we're allowing a tragedy to continue that we know needs to be addressed. That's what's at stake.
And when you look at Galena Park, which is past 19 additional officers or campuses, it's looking more like a reactive approach, and you all are looking at a proactive approach. What's your response to districts looking at adding more officers, adding more armed officers to combat this?
Folks are still trying to find exactly what happened, right, in Uvalde. But one thing we know is there were plenty of officers. And then there's the other instance recently. There was an officer, but he didn't go in. There was a door, there wasn't a door. There's always going to be some reason why the perfect plan doesn't work out, because we're all humans. You can't control every single detail. But what we know, what's the common thread throughout all of these tragedies, is the easy access to a gun by people who shouldn't be having that weapon. So That's what we need to get at. We need to get at the root causes. We need to be proactive. We shouldn't just wait for a tragedy to try the same strategies we've tried before. It's a terrible feeling of deja vu, and we're all living it. We know we had these conversations before. We talked about arming teachers. We talked about more officers. And yes, you need safety, but I'm afraid it's a distraction from what's truly the subject matter and what's going to allow us to get in front of this tragedy, and that is gun safety policies, and that can really only happen at the state level and the federal level.
Senator Ellis, how realistic is it in this day and age to pass any sort of legislation with the atmosphere that's been going on? I mean,
it's always difficult. The Cornyn compromise as it's being done shows that there is a reaction this go round. I mean, this one, the timing of it, you know, after El Paso, there was a moment of intense interest. It's a lot of pressure. The fact that Senator Cornyn and his colleagues came up with a compromise so quick, as limited as it is, at least indicates to me as a politician, they feel the heat. And so I think that's why it's important to research the judges asked for. Us passing a resolution, I hope it has bipartisan support. Even people, some of my colleagues who may have some heartburn over some of those issues, what's wrong with having a special session to discuss them now, before children go back to school?
because this seems to be a topic that historically has always become more of a divide than...
People are afraid of the money. Make no mistake about it. Those folks who refuse to take action are afraid of a powerful lobby, the NRA, one of the most powerful ones in the history of the country. Even if, as the judge is alluding to, if we could afford a police officer in every classroom in America, there's very little defense for any officer against a semi-automatic weapon. And you know that you're asking that person to accept a death sentence when they do that. It's just reality.
What are you hearing from your colleagues? Like, what's the pushback that you're hearing from colleagues about gun control and semi-automatic
People
weapons?
that I talked to in the legislature, and I was there a long time, you know, people are following the leader. It's ridiculous. So it's intense. I mean, look, you all play a role more than anything else. I'm a pretty good student of history. You ought to go out, particularly since we haven't been able to do anything else, I'm listening to more audio books I've ever listened to. And it's just amazing the role that children played. I can imagine the intense guilt that Martin Luther King must have had after presiding over that funeral of those little girls bombed in a church. But, you know, he figured out how to make a way out of a tragedy. You know, that sacrifice passed major civil rights legislation. So as tragic as this is, I admire these families. Look, I have an 18-year-old daughter. They'll be 19 in a couple of weeks. In college for a year. 2 hours from Buffalo at Syracuse. And, you know.
En español, but I'm going to ask you in English. I spoke to a teacher in Uvalde when this happened. The teacher was inside the school when this happened. She clearly states that in her mind, nobody else is guilty of this tragedy and the past 5 as Governor Abbott. And she blames other politicians to be politically correct in not naming him as the full responsible person for this. Do you agree en español?
Mire, estamos en un ambiente tan dividido, tan tristemente dividido, que para mí es difícil no por política, sino solamente por preocupación de los ataques que enfrenta la gente, el llamar a cualquier persona culpable por muertes de otros. Eso es algo serio. Ahora, ¿qué sí voy a decir que es muy claro? Este muchacho que mató a tantos niños tuvo acceso a un arma por las leyes que no se han pasado. ¿Quién es responsable de pasar las leyes? Los legisladores estatales. Y solo lo pueden hacer si el gobernador llama una sesión especial de la legislatura. Entonces, ¿fue su culpa esas muertes? Mire, es que es difícil decir eso. Eso prácticamente es algo que dice Dios o dicen las cortes. Pero lo que sí puedo decir con toda la seguridad es que en sus manos está que haya cambio y que se prevengan más tragedias como estas. Eso es lo que puedo decir.
Senator Ellis in Spanish.
Okay, thank
You
you.
wanna add some, Senator?
Hey, I totally agree with that parent. Governor Abbott, as it relates to this state, bears responsibility. The President of the Senate, Governor Patrick, bears responsibility. Speaker of the House bears responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you.
La cosa es que ya hemos estado aquí.